Sufi studies is a particular branch of comparative studies that uses the technical lexicon of the Islamic mystics, the Sufis, to exemplify the nature of its ideas, hence the frequent reference to Sufi orders. It may be divided into two main branches, the orientalist academic and the spiritual. Early Sufi studies in France. The earliest Europeans to study Sufism were French, associated with the Quietist movement. They were Barthélemy de Herbelot de Molenval, a professor at the Collège de France who worked from texts available in Europe, François Bernier, the physician of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb who spent 1655–69 in the Islamic world, and François Pécuties de Lacroix, a diplomat who spent 1674–1676 in Isfahan, where he studied Rumi's Masnavi and visited the Bektashi order. D'Herbelot's great work, the Bibliothèque Orientale, included an entry on Sufism and detailed entries on al-Hallaj Najmeddin Kubra, and Abd al-Karim Jili. There were a number of references to the Masnavi and to Rumi, and there may also have been entries on them. Bernier published an article on Sufism entitled Mémoires sur le quiétisme des Indes in the periodical Histoire des ouvrages des savants in September 1688. Following this article, there is said to have developed in France a view that the French expression of the creed of pure love was in fact a disguised form of Islam. The debate over quietism between the bishops Fénelon and Bossuet was remembered as the Querelle du Père Mort. Many quietists were imprisoned, others exercised caution and self-censorship. Pécuties de Lacroix did not publish himself, but his son gave reasons why he thought them Evlavir perfect quietists. D'Herbelot de Molenval's Bibliothèque Orientale went through several editions, one of the last of which was the 1777 edition printed in The Hague. It has been suggested that some entries on Sufi topics that were present in the 1697 edition were absent from the 1777 edition. The word Sufi appears. Early translations. In 1671, Edward Pocock, the son of Oxford Professor Edward Pocock, published a Latin translation of the Ibn Yachthan of Ibn Tufayl. This led to a number of other translations, including the English translations of 1674 and 1686, and a Dutch translation of 1701. The anonymous Dutch translator S.D.B. gave a concise biographical review of the philosophers related to the text: Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Rushdi, Junayd, and Mansur al-Hallaj. Ibn Yachthan may have partly inspired Robinson Crusoe. In 1812, Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall published a translation of the Divan of Hafiz, which was received with delight by Goethe, who was inspired by it to publish in 1819 his Westostliche Divan. A Sufi appears in Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's play Nathan der Wise, first produced in 1779. Though it is not clear from where Lessing learned of Sufism, perhaps through his association with Johann Jacob Rieske. In 1821, F. A. G. Tholuck published Sufism as Sive Theosophia Passarum Pantheistica in Berlin. Early sociological studies. One of the earliest sociological treatments of Sufism is to be found in Sir John Malcolm's 1825 work, The History of Persia, for the most early period to the present time, containing an account of the religion, government, usages and character of the inhabitants of that kingdom. Malcolm's treatment, though interesting, is not well informed. In an account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians written in Egypt during the years 1833 to 1835, Edward William Lane noted, and illustrated with his own woodcuts, his close observations of the Rifa'id derwishes while living in Cairo, in disguise. The success of his work also introduced the success of the disguise. Sir Richard Burton's personal narrative of a pilgrimage to El Medina and Mecca was undertaken while traveling as a Qadiri, and Armand van Bury reached Bavadin near Bukhara to visit the shrine of Baha'u'ddin Naqshband Bukhari in 1863 in the guise of a murad. Voyage dans l'Asie centrale, de Tehran Akiva, Bukhara Samarkand, par Arminius van Bury. Savant Honghua Deguisse and Dervish was the subject of 4 installments of the popular and copiously illustrated Le Tour du Monde. Nouveau Journal des Voyages, Paris, Londres, Leipzig 1865. Dexumi semester Hachette Cied. The disguise was by no means superficial and necessitated a variety of resources in linguistics and social integration that left marks far beyond the mere popular success of travelogues. Towards the end of the 19th century, the resistance to the European conquest of North Africa was often led by Sufis, notably Abd al-Qadir and later the Sufi order. This drew further attention to Sufis and Sufism, and a number of studies were performed and published. These generally suffered from their authors' preoccupations with security. Ague acute elitaguenon. One line of 20th-century Sufi studies that came to fruition in the West appears to have been born from many colors in a painter's workshop. It was the Swedish painter Ivan Ague acute Eli who, inspired by the quasi-occult tradition developing en marge of the great workshops of Paul Gauguin and Émile Bernard, took his intellectual search into the realm of Sufism proper. This culminated into his initiation, in Egypt, by Sheikh Rahman Elish Kabir into the Shadili Tariqa. When he returned to Paris from his travels in the East in 1909, he found a mind receptive to his own spiritual affiliation in the person of René Guénon, whom in turn he initiated into the Shadili order. René Guénon, who finally settled in Cairo where he died a convert to Islam under his adopted name of Abdul Wahid Yahya, had an enormous influence on a circle of friends centered around the periodical Lin Knows that he had started in 1909. This circle pooled the resources of A.O. Fridtjof Schuon, Titus Burckhardt, Marco Pallas, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Martin Lingzi, each with his own focus on Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. René Guénon focused on a measure of criticism towards what he called solidified forms of initiation in the West, Freemasonry in particular, which he sought to revive in reference to Emir Abd al-Qadir, whose name was widely respected among Masons. If one looks at the aspect of Sufi initiation proper, the following background to René Guénon's brand of perennial tradition emerges. Through his affiliation with the Shadili order, he was branched to the Akbari chain, going back to the greatest Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi. Seminal research on the inspiration of Ibn Arabi and the Shadili and its projection in the works of Dante and St. John of the Cross came from the great Christian scholar Miguel Hassan Palacios Abd al-Qadir and al-Tijani. The Akbari already had a history of initiation in Western Europe in the person of Emir Abd al-Qadir, the noble opponent of the French in their colonial struggle over Algeria, who they had held sequestered at the Chateau d'Amboise. In 1858 the Imprimerie Nationale had printed his Rappel à l'intelligent avis à l'ignorant, an essay he had sent to the Société Asiatique in 1855. The Emir Abd al-Qadir had been initiated into the Naqshbandi by Sheikh Diyar el-Din Khalid al-Sharaziri and into the Qadiri by his own father Sidi Muhyiddin, who led a North African branch of the Qadiri order. In 1863, during his Hajj, he met with Muhammad al-Farsi al-Shadili, who became his last living teacher in Mecca. Muhammad al-Farsi al-Shadili's proper teacher had been initiated into the Shadili by al-Arabi ad-Darqawi, some of whose letters were translated by Martin Lings. They form the background to Martin Lings' outline of the autobiographical writings of Ahmad al-Alawi, who was linked to the Shadili through ad-Darqawi. Sheikh Ahmad al-Alawi died in 1932. An approach from a different angle may be traced to Sheikh Ahmad al-Tijani, who died in Fez in 1815 and was said to be the inheritor of the paths of his time. A.O. Qadiri and Shadili. Sheikh Hamala ben Muhammad ben Sidna Omar, who died in forced exile to France, lies buried in Montfaucon, France. He was the former Qutb al-Zaman of the Tijaniya. A moving account of the circumstances of his death is given by the great African traditionalist and cultural ambassador Amadou Hampâté Bâ, himself a Tijani, in the biography of his own Sheikh Tiano Bokar. Masin Yontanaso. Thus the current into which the friends of the traditionalist school had tapped proved to be a lively one. René Guénin's wish to edit a series of Sufi translations was frustrated, but in the meantime Louis Massignon had prepared himself for the task. By 1922, his introduction to the technical lexicon of Sufism and the Passion of al-Hallaj initiated the first line of textual study, translation and publication of sources that developed into the watershed of which the chief engineers were Henry Corbin and Sayyid Hossein Nasser. Since the observation is pertinent that thus far the watershed is fed from a distinct French sphere of influence, a mental exercise is needed to broaden the view. It is clear that Sayyid Hossein Nasser's participation in the collaboration with Henry Corbin infused this field with a genuine consideration for some of the finer aspects of Islamic culture as seen from a proper native source, Iran, and adding a distinct contemporary sting to ecology. It may be interesting to compare two contributions to Sufi studies from this same angle. Sayyid Hossein Nasser, Revelation, Intellect and Reason in the Quran, in Sufi Essays, London and Albany, New York, 1972. Reza Arista, Psychology of the Sufi Way to Individuation, in Sufi Studies East and West, Rushbrook Williams ed., New York, 1973. Both describe the control over the nafs, the spiritual breaths that color man's essential character, a study comparing intelligence in its Western and Eastern traditional form. P.R. Arista had already introduced this Sufi way in his academical work on psychiatric theory. Idris Shah. Professor Reza Arista, M.D., wrote in honor of Sayyid Idris Shah, whose stature as a scholar was as fiercely disputed as his communication to a general public was successful. Nevertheless, Sayyid Idris Shah caused the English feed of the watershed to be explored, through his own accessible style of writing, by providing affordable publications of great classical texts, and rebelliously askew on the niceties of an Oxford-Cambridge kind of rivalry over P.R. Nicholson and P.R. Arbery, and to exactly what extent can now easily be verified by the student willing to compare for himself the 11 Naqshbandi rules or exercise aims listed by Sayyid Idris Shah in Chapter 7 of Oriental Magic in 1957 with those presently divulged through the proper channel. They are indeed the same. Oriental Magic was read as a comparative study at the London Ethnological Institute. Sufi studies in general are directed as comparative studies of human understanding, and can be read as essays in psychosociology. Margaret Smith, Special note could be taken of the little-cited but brilliant academic Margaret Smith, who wrote on the history of mysticism in the Near and Middle East from a woman's perspective, leading to classic pages on early Christian mysticism, women in the early Christian Church, Christianity and Islam at the beginning of the Islamic era, the rise of Sufism and the early ascetic ideal. Two exemplaries of her subject matter she studied in closer detail, Rabra al-Adawiyya and Harith al-Muhasibi. The summary of her work reposes in her Studies in Early Mysticism in the Near and Middle East, being an account of the rise and development of Christian mysticism up to the 7th century, of the subsequent development of mysticism in Islam, known as Sufism, and of the relationship between Christian and Islamic mysticism, with references, a bibliography and 2 indexes dedicated to the memory of Thomas Walker Arnold. London, 1931. The Sheldon Press, reprinted 1973 by Philo Press CV, Amsterdam. Later academics. By the end of the 20th century, the academic study of Sufism was well established in university departments of religious studies. The perspectives of these later scholars varied. Some were purely scientific, while some followed in the line of Massignon, or in the line of Guénon and the traditionalists, modified somewhat for an academic environment. For a contemporary academical state-of-the-art, see Sufism in the West Bibliography pp. 190–202.